A psychopathic man traps his one-sided love in a cage, unaware of her true identity as a real monster. Stay tuned to know the full video. In the beginning of the movie, we are shown a man named Seth. Seth's days were painfully predictable, one bleeding into the next without color or meaning. Every morning he awoke in his small, dimly lit apartment, the stale air clinging to his skin like a film. He had neither family nor friends to check in on him, and there was no one to ask how his day had been. It had been years since Seth had experienced any real connection with another person. His job at the animal control department had been his entire existence for what felt like an eternity. Day after day, he was tasked with capturing stray animals, creatures that the world saw as pests. But to Seth, these animals were more than mere nuisances. They were the only beings that seemed to understand him. One evening, as the weight of another day pressed down on him, Seth boarded the bus home. The faint hum of conversation and the rattle of the bus's engine barely registered in his mind until someone caught his eye. A woman sitting across from him stirred something deep within his foggy memory. His heart quickened as he stood, walking toward her seat, unsure of what he would say. "Hi," he murmured awkwardly, standing before her. She glanced up, her expression blank, her brow furrowed in mild confusion. "We went to high school together," Seth continued, a note of desperation creeping into his voice. The woman, her name was Holly, looked at him, her face betraying nothing. Seth's gaze searched hers, hoping for even a flicker of recognition. But there was nothing. "I'm sorry," she said, shaking her head politely. "I don't remember you." Seth's stomach churned. He had built up the moment in his mind, but now, standing before her, he was nothing more than a stranger. Holly was different from him, her life full of things he could barely imagine. She had a job as a waitress, a boyfriend, a life. When Seth awkwardly suggested they grab a cup of coffee to reconnect, Holly smiled. But it was strained, the kind of smile you give to someone you want to get away from. "I'm already with someone," she said, her words final. As the bus slowed to her stop, she stood up and stepped off without another glance. The bus doors hissed shut behind her, but something had shifted inside Seth. Holly didn't remember him, but he remembered her. And now, he needed to know more. That night, back in his apartment, Seth couldn't get Holly out of his mind. Her face, her voice, the way she had so casually dismissed him. It gnawed at him, burrowing deep into his thoughts. Sitting in the dim light of his living room, Seth logged into a social networking site, typing Holly's name into the search bar. In seconds, her profile appeared. It was like stepping into another world, a vibrant, colorful life so different from his own. She had friends, photos, memories. She had traveled, laughed, loved. Everything Seth lacked, Holly seemed to possess effortlessly. And so his fascination grew. What started as innocent curiosity quickly spiraled into something much darker. Each night after work, Seth would sit at his computer, poring over Holly's online presence. He learned where she worked, her favorite places to visit, the things she liked. He began to make notes, scribbling details into a small, tattered notebook, as though he were studying her. Holly wasn't just someone from his past now. She had become his obsession. The next day, Seth decided to take things a step further. He knew where Holly worked. He had seen it on her profile. She was a waitress at a cozy restaurant downtown. On his lunch break, he visited the restaurant, his heart pounding as he walked in. He scanned the room until he saw her, moving between tables, taking orders. Seth sat down at a booth hoping she might notice him, but when she did approach, tray in hand, there was no recognition in her eyes. "What can I get you?" she asked. Seth's throat tightened. "It's me," he said softly. "We met on the bus yesterday. I asked you out for coffee." Holly blinked, her expression unchanged. She didn't remember him. Again. It was as if he didn't exist in her world, as though he were invisible. "I'm sorry, I'm really busy," she said, her voice tinged with frustration, before she hurried away to another table. Seth's heart sank. The rejection stung deeply, and it wasn't just the fact that she didn't recognize him. It was that she had no interest in even knowing his name. He felt invisible. unwanted. That night, as Holly walked home from her shift, she sensed something, a presence. At first, she shrugged it off, but then she noticed the same figure from the bus. Seth. He was following her. When she finally reached the safety of her apartment, Holly locked the door behind her, her hands trembling. She told her best friend Claire about the encounter, about the man who wouldn't leave her alone. There was something deeply unsettling about the way he watched her. The next day, Holly received a bouquet of flowers at work. At first, she smiled, thinking they were from her boyfriend Eric, as an apology for a recent argument. But when she thanked him, Eric was confused. He hadn't sent any flowers. Holly's blood ran cold as the realization dawned. They were from Seth. That evening, as she walked home, Seth appeared again. "I sent you those flowers," he said, his voice hopeful, almost childlike. Holly's heart pounded in her chest, fear and anger bubbling inside her. "Stay away from me," she shouted. Before Seth could respond, Eric appeared, furious. The confrontation escalated quickly. Eric struck Seth, the blows landing hard, leaving him bleeding and bruised on the sidewalk. But the pain didn't register for Seth. His mind was elsewhere, fixated on Holly. In the chaos, he had managed to steal her diary from her bag, a small leather-bound book she carried everywhere. That night, back in his apartment, Seth opened the diary. Inside, he found Holly's private thoughts, her secrets laid bare. She wasn't perfect, far from it. The words on those pages revealed a darkness in her, a side of Holly she had never shown the world. And in those pages, Seth believed he had found his purpose. He needed to save her, from herself. Seth's obsession morphed into something dangerous. He constructed a steel cage in the basement of the animal shelter, a place where no one would think to look. It wasn't for the animals he worked with, it was for Holly. In his twisted mind, he believed he was protecting her. He stole a powerful tranquilizer from the clinic where the animals were treated. To test its potency, he injected himself first. His body went limp, paralyzed for several minutes. The drug worked perfectly. That night, he waited outside Holly's apartment, lurking in the shadows. As she unlocked her door, Seth struck, injecting her with the tranquilizer. Her body collapsed into his arms, unconscious. Gently, he carried her to the shelter, placing her in the steel box he had built. Holly woke in complete darkness, her head pounding. She was in a cage. Her hands were raw, her fingernail torn from the desperate attempts to claw her way out. She screamed, but the only response was the deafening noise of barking dogs above her. No one could hear her. Seth visited her periodically, bringing her food and water, along with a toilet. Each time he tried to connect with her, asking her to remember his name, to understand that he was keeping her safe. His love for her was all-consuming, though warped beyond recognition. But Holly was no longer just a victim. She began to manipulate Seth, using his obsession against him. She played along with his delusions, telling him she might love him too. Her words were careful, calculated, designed to make him believe she was falling for him. And for a while, it worked. One day, Nate, the security guard at the shelter, grew suspicious of Seth's frequent trips to the basement. When Nate questioned him, Seth panicked. Holly, sensing his fear, urged him to kill Nate before he could expose their secret. In a moment of blind panic, Seth grabbed a rock and, with trembling hands, struck Nate. The blow landed with a sickening thud, and Nate crumpled to the floor. Seth stood over the body, horrified by what he had done. He had never taken a life before, but now there was no turning back. Holly's words echoed in his mind. "Kill him or we're both finished." Seth's stomach churned as reality set in. He had crossed a line from which there was no return. But Holly's manipulation had worked. Her voice was in his head, guiding him. She convinced him that Nate's body had to be disposed of quickly, and with terrifying clarity, she laid out the steps. Cut him into pieces, feed him to the dogs, make sure there's nothing left. With trembling hands, Seth followed her instructions. His mind detached from the horror of his actions. Piece by piece, he dismembered Nate's body, feeding the remains to the animals in the shelter. For 2 days, the dogs devoured the evidence, erasing all traces of Nate's existence. As the day passed, Seth became increasingly paranoid. Nate's disappearance did not go unnoticed, and soon the police began investigating the shelter. Seth was now a suspect, and the pressure weighed heavily on him. Every knock on the door, every questioning glance from his co-workers sent him into a spiral of fear. His nerves were frayed, and the only person who seemed to offer him solace was Holly, caged in the basement. But Holly's behavior was shifting. No longer the helpless victim, she had taken control of the situation. Her manipulation became more insidious, her words laced with venom and deceit. She dared him to prove his love for her, and her demand was chilling. "If you love me, you'll give me something of yourself. Prove it. Cut off your finger." At first, Seth recoiled in shock, but Holly's words were seductive, her voice soft and persuasive. "If you really love me, this is nothing. It's just a finger." Her taunts pushed him to the brink, and before long, Seth was holding a knife in his trembling hand. He hesitated only briefly before severing his own finger, the pain blinding, the blood pouring from the wound. When he unlocked the cage, believing that she had finally fallen for him, she whispered sweet lies into his ear, convincing him that she loved him, that they could be together. Holly lunged. With the same knife Seth had used on himself, she slashed his throat in one swift motion. Blood sprayed from the wound as Seth collapsed. Holly stood over him for a moment, watching the life drain from his eyes. Then, without a word, she fled the shelter. Months passed, and Holly's life seemed to have returned to normal. Her relationship with Eric, though strained, continued. But something had changed within her, something darker, more insidious. She had tasted power, manipulation, and control, and it lingered beneath the surface, hidden behind her calm exterior. One day, Holly visited a remote, filthy house far from the city. Inside, she unlocked a door and stepped into a dimly lit room. The air was heavy with the stench of decay. In the corner, chained to the wall, was a man, disheveled, gaunt, and barely recognizable. His hair was matted, his skin pale and stretched over his bones. Holly stood before him, her expression cold, detached. She had become something else entirely, a shadow of the person she once was, and Seth had been her first victim in this new chapter of her life. The audience is left with an unsettling question. Who was the real monster all along? Comment down your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. We are so close to hit 400 subscribe, so hit it hard.